Sophie, thanks so much for joining us on the Sporting Transition podcast today. Really grateful for you to join us and free up a bit of time this afternoon to go through your own sporting transition and share the journey that you went on and through to where you are today. So I guess a really great place to start would just be for you to introduce yourself really quickly, who you are, what your sport was, and what you do now. And yeah, I'm sure we'll springboard straight from that into loads of other questions that will hopefully give our audience some insights into a journey into sales.
Yeah, fab, sounds good. Thanks for having me for starters. Yeah, so I'm Sophie. I'm an ex-international swimmer, and I'm now an SDR at a tech company called Samsara. I've been an SDR now for 2 years, so just started my sales career, but thoroughly enjoying, so happy to be here.
Cool, good stuff. Tell us a little bit about your swimming career, because when we read online, there's obviously a couple of articles about you going back from when you were super young, kind of 12, 13, people already talking about what you might be able to achieve in the future. At what age did you realize, okay, I'm pretty good at this, and now it's probably the time for me to double down on my commitment towards the sport?
Good question. I think for me, it was probably around that 12, 13, like you mentioned. But I think the biggest factor was I swam a mile when I was 5, which at the time I didn't really realize how ridiculous that was. But I know you've got young kids yourself, and
yes, it's ridiculous.
That is quite ridiculous. So yeah, I think that was the point where people sort of thought, oh, maybe we should take this a little bit more seriously, and then sort of grew from that. I competed in my first competitions around like 6 or 7. Back then, the regulations weren't quite as tight as they are now with regards to well-being of children racing against each other at the age of 6. But it put me in good stead and going forward. But that 12, 13 was probably where I started to really take it seriously.
And what were your aspirations, I suppose, when you were a kid? So yes, you're swimming from a young age. You might already be dreaming about great things in swimming. But did you have other career paths in mind where in primary school, teachers would often say, oh, who wants to be a doctor? Who wants to be, a pilot, or whatever else? Who wants to be a bricklayer? In that same classroom, what would you have put your hand up to say that you wanted to be when you were a little bit older?
I would say I probably had 2 personalities. I always wanted to be an Olympian, which unfortunately I didn't do. And I would have also put my hand up to say that I wanted to be a doctor, which evidently I also didn't do. But yeah, I think always had like the highest of aspirations in both sort of areas when it comes to swimming and academics.
So you kind of have this dream of potentially the Olympics, potentially being a doctor. And we've spoken before a little bit about you being quite academic generally anyway. So you kind of enjoyed being a good student. So as you're going through this kind of age of 11, 12, 13, 14, where you're clearly starting to blossom in swimming, you're doing really well, but you're bringing some good times. How do you juggle that balance in your head of, okay, what am I? Am I an aspiring doctor, or am I an aspiring swimmer? Or actually, did you manage to find a pretty good balance of being able to dream on both fronts, knowing that they're not actually exclusive ambitions to have?
Yeah, it was really hard. I think at the younger end of that age that we were just talking about, like at 12, 13, I would say that I balanced it really well. I think in the grand scheme of things, whilst I would have thought school was quite difficult, it probably really wasn't in terms of sort of extracurricular time that I needed to put in. I sort of went to school between 9 and 3 or 8:30 and 3:30. And any time outside of that, I was able to focus on the sporting side of things. It changed quite a lot once I started my A-levels. I feel like trying to optimize the 2 completely almost conflicting pathways was really hard. Being all in one meant that there were sacrifices in the other. So it was quite difficult to balance both time and also like energy and recovering and spending all that energy in the right place.
I think Alistair Brownlee got into study medicine, but in the end decided to focus on his sporting career.
Yeah.
And you could argue it paid dividends and it's worked out. But it shows actually the huge sacrifice you do have to make. He's potentially gone from this dream of being a doctor, which for many people is also a dream, and instead focusing on his sporting career. So yeah, I can see the challenge in trying to balance both together. I mean, just out of curiosity, how many hours would you be in the pool even at the age of kind of 11, 12, 13?
So I started doing early morning sessions at 11, the first year of secondary school. So I think that's 11. So from then it was upwards of 20 hours a week in the pool. So it was 10 2-hour sessions. Obviously, being only 7 days in the week meant that 3 of them were double sessions. So I was doing those in the mornings before school when I was 13. So I started doing the early mornings before school at 13. And that continued right the way through until I stopped. So it's a big chunk of time. And obviously that 20 hours is only the training time. That doesn't count the time to travel to the pool, which was 45 minutes to an hour. The sort of pre-pool time, as they would call it, which is like stretching, activation, that sort of stuff. So all in all, it was probably upwards of like 40 hours a week was spent on traveling, training, preparing.
That's some big commitment. And did you ever have a sense of kind of missing out or feeling like, man, my other friends are doing this weekend, I'd love to kind of be doing that as well? Or did you find that actually you were still able to get a bit of balance on that side as well?
Yeah, that's quite a difficult question to answer, I think. Looking back, I think I missed out on a lot. But at the time, I sort of cared about my performance that much that I didn't really think about it. I think also balanced with the fact that I had a lot of swimming friends, and obviously a lot of my like social circle was in swimming. I didn't at the time feel like I missed out too much, but it's only now looking back 10, 15 years, I think that there was like a lot of things which normal kids get to do that I was just too busy to even think about going to.
I can imagine. And when things start getting really serious, it probably takes even a bigger demand on you. At what point were you starting to think, okay, I firstly have aspirations to be an Olympian, as you mentioned earlier, as a child, almost dreaming. At what point did you believe that can happen? If you put the work in, you will be able to do it? Or did you have doubts already at maybe 14, 15 or whatever age that actually maybe this is just not something I'm going to be able to do? Or did you believe that actually I stand a chance, but I just need to be able to find the time to train and have the right structure around me?
Yeah, I think I always believed I had a chance. And the point where I realized that the chance was less realistic is the point that I decided to walk away. But throughout the whole time, I like always believed that I had a chance. I still believe that I had a chance if I could have put or had decided to put everything into it. I think probably when I was 12 or 13, I was still swimming in a very small swimming club, which was just down the street from where I lived in the valleys, which was obviously, as you can imagine, didn't have like the resources, the pool time, the extra things, nutritionist, physio, all that sort of stuff, like wasn't heard of. And the coaches there at the time had said, it's probably time that you leave here now. Like we've done all we can and we think you should move on to training in one of the like bigger city clubs. It was probably at that point where I realized like I've got a really big chance. And then I didn't really look back after that. Like once I made that move, like that one person believes in you and tells you should probably give it a good go. From then on, it was sort of everything was going into it to give it as best of a chance as possible.
Yeah, and you've talked about kind of being all in and really committing to it. Obviously, hindsight's a wonderful thing. How much different do you think your swimming career could have been if you were able to commit absolutely everything to it? Obviously, you spoke a little bit about Tom, your now husband, who was at university. He was swimming in the morning, resting, then racing, training in the afternoon, and he'd do that pretty much every day. So his ability to recover was much stronger. But I don't think you quite had the same opportunity in your swimming career. So very hypothetical question to ask, but had all of those things been in place, what do you think could have been possible? And I know you think about it because, as an amateur triathlete myself, I always look back at my times and I always tell myself, well, if I didn't have 2 kids and if I wasn't working full time, guaranteed I would have taken 2 minutes off that 5K time.
100%. Yeah, I think completely different. Like absolutely completely different. I look at some people that I swam at the same time as, some of which are actually in sales now, which is interesting. But they are sort of experienced. And again, it was my choice. Like it's not a, oh, I couldn't, or, you know, I didn't have the opportunity to be able to do that. Like I decided that I was going to do it the way I did. And I don't have any regrets in that sense. But if I had put everything only into sport for the duration of my career, I have absolutely no doubt that like it would have been completely different. I may have still been swimming now, but other parts of my life would be completely different as well. But just that, firstly, I guess, ability to like focus everything onto one thing makes a huge difference. And you touched on it there, like the recovery, the eating, the sort of mental capacity that you have for stuff, like concentrating on A levels, uni, grades, missing 2 or 3 weeks of school at a time to travel to competitions, then having to catch up. I was never fully in sport, and that definitely had like a huge impact on performance and the decision to leave when I did, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And what was the kind of transition point for you then? I mean, what was the kind of trigger in your career or your sporting career to say, okay, this is kind of done, and I'm now going to move on to something else?
Yeah, so I'd started university, and I was just having to make the decision of whether to be all in for the next Olympic cycle. And I wasn't prepared to do that and give up. Obviously, give up is quite a drastic way of phrasing it, but give up the university side of things to be all in for the next 4 years. And so I needed to make a decision there, whether I was firstly like happy with what I'd done and achieved and experienced so far. And secondly, was I prepared to put myself through all of that for another 4 years? And ultimately, the decision was that I wasn't going to do that for the next 4 years, because I'd experienced so many things and I was satisfied with what I'd done, despite not achieving that sort of ultimate goal of going to the Olympics. I just couldn't justify going through another 4-year cycle, sacrificing the academic side of things and obviously future career aspect. But it's a big decision. Like, it's obviously part of who you are. For like, everyone knows me as a swimmer. Even now, if you ask someone from school, like, oh, which one, they'd say the swimmer. So to decide to walk away was a big decision, but I think they were like the main factors.
It's also quite a mature decision, I guess, to be able to take that step back and really assess it in the way that you did. How influential were your parents in that process or in that deliberation, either actively during that time or through their kind of upbringing with you, where they'd kind of implanted the importance of education? So they may not have been proactively involved in actually making a decision with you, but actually all the seeds that they planted throughout your youth and your swimming career kind of led you to believe that actually this would be the right thing to take, the university course and getting an education above the hypothetical dream of potentially qualifying for the Olympics.
Yeah, 100%. Like, they are my biggest supporters, even like to this day. My parents have been like my number one supporters, but in every decision. And when that decision was sort of coming to being one of walking away, they were still like just as supportive. I think they'd always made sure that I'd kept that academic side going, and that sort of, I guess, like fire in my belly to be good at something else as well, rather than just ticking boxes and going to school because I had to. So that played a huge part. But yeah, I had like many a conversation with them of, was I making the right choice? I think a lot of sports you can probably go back to. But I think once you leave swimming, such a big amount of, like, large amount of training, long hours. And once you walk away, there's not really any going back unless it's within a matter of weeks. Otherwise, you've lost like all the work you've done over the past few years. So yeah, they were a huge part of it, and just making sure that I stayed like grounded throughout the whole time. Like, this is not a forever thing. So you need to make sure that you've got like other things that you can fall back on when the time comes.
Yeah, that's interesting. It makes obviously makes tons of sense as well. Quite mature in a lot of ways. So I guess that takes us to the next part of the conversation around what you do when you decide to step away. I think you studied biomedical sciences as part of your degree at Swansea, and then that led you into making another career choice, which didn't end up being your ultimate career choice, which you might still be working out for yourself even now. But yeah, talk us through a little bit that transition, because it is a super interesting one. Obviously the podcast this season in particular looks a lot around people moving into sales. But that's just one career path. I mean, there's so many career paths that, elite athletes, I'm sure, could be extremely successful in. It just so happens this season we're focusing on people who've moved into sales roles. You explored medicine. I'm sure that's on the cards for many other people as well. So just talk us through a little bit about that experience and how it helped you actually realize what you really wanted coming out of that time studying for it.
So, I guess a long-winded journey into sales compared to some people. But yeah, I was studying biomedical sciences when I was still swimming. So I was training in Swansea in the High Performance Centre, and I was going to Swansea Uni. They didn't have an undergraduate medicine degree, which is why I studied biomedical sciences in the first place. It always been put in that basket at school, like what we talked about earlier. I come from an area where if you're even a tiny bit academic, you're either going to be a doctor or a lawyer. There isn't a choice. Like, that's what I put into, and I was very, very much put into that box, despite all the other things I had going on, which maybe was a good thing, maybe wasn't, who knows. So yeah, I did my biomed degree. I graduated in 2020, obviously in the middle of the pandemic, which was probably a good time to explore something that didn't end up working out, because, it was a perfect time kind of stopped for everybody, which has ended up working quite nicely for me looking back. So I applied to do graduate entry medicine in Swansea. So it's another 4-year degree after the 3-year one that I just finished. I did get a place, and I thought, I'm going to have to try, because if I turn this place down, I may not ever get one again. And then I'll always ask myself, like, what if? Like, maybe that was, my calling, or however people like to view being a doctor. So I did that for 2 years. I hated every single second. It wasn't for me at all. I did 3 long placements, which sort of solidified that it was the job rather than the course. I loved the course. I loved learning about all the medical side of things. I just didn't love the job. And I think that stemmed from the fact that there was just such a big gap after swimming, that like something just wasn't right. Like, I'd always been judged on performance. I'd always been analysing every tiny little thing that I ate or did, or all that sort of stuff. And then going into something completely different where none of that is monitored. You just tick boxes almost throughout your degree. And yeah, there was just a massive gap that needed filling, which I tried a bit of CrossFit. I entered a half marathon, and nothing was sort of filling that void. And that's when I decided that was the time to leave that and find sort of something more long-term that filled that gap, and I guess brought the fulfillment back again.
I mean, it's such a big decision to make, to give up a medicine course. I mean, obviously the entry rates are incredibly competitive. The places are like gold dust. So once you get in, you kind of want to hold on to it. So it must have been a big decision, not taken lightly. Yeah, I kind of want to ask if there's any parallels in, your ability to endure swimming. I'm sure there was a lot of stuff in swimming that was mind-blowingly boring, being in the pool so early every day, probably doing a lot of similar sets, but you endured it for probably the best part of 10 odd years. Did you sometimes reflect at the time and think, okay, this is, once I get through this, it will get better? Or did the placements really kind of dictate to you that this just isn't for me as a career path?
Yeah, I found myself falling into that mindset quite a lot of, I do not like giving up on anything. And that's what kept me there for even the 2 years that I was there. I could probably have told you very early on that it wasn't for me, maybe even before I'd started, really. I think if you're not 100% definite on it, you probably shouldn't do it. And that's my biggest learning from it. I think I had like many a conversation with people who were much further along in their careers. Obviously, being on placement, you get to speak to registrars and consultants who have been working in that role for 5, 6, sometimes 10 years. And they said, if you feel like this now, like it's not going to get any better. Like, don't fall into the trap of, I've got to finish. You get ranked in your uni year in deciles. So that was the nearest you get to a target. So they rank you in a 10. People were saying, oh, how can you leave if you're top decile, or however they would say. But the doctors that I spoke to would be like, it doesn't get better. If you don't like it now, that's never going to change. There'll always be something that's worth staying for. But as a bigger picture, if you can't imagine yourself living this lifestyle for the next 30 years, like now is your time to leave. And I'll always be grateful for their honesty, because otherwise I would still be there, like definitely.
Yeah. Big decision to make. And yeah, it sounds like you had some very supportive colleagues. Just to backtrack a little bit, I mean, why for you? It sounds like your relationship with swimming overall has been quite healthy, and you've enjoyed it. It was a good place, and just reading on the web as well, you talk quite a lot around the importance of the people around you, and how they really encourage you to be a good athlete and having a lot of confidence in yourself. Why not put that back into swimming? I know swimming, you're probably not going to make the same money as either as a doctor or as someone in sales, well, potentially if you're the absolute top end of it, but why not kind of go down that path as something that allows you to do or continue to be involved with something that you maybe love, and also kind of give back to others what people gave to you in swimming? But was that on the cards, or was it just not really something you considered too actively?
That's a very good question, and probably a question I still ask myself sometimes. I actually taught swimming when I was at uni. So when I first finished swimming, obviously the uni's right next to the pool. I needed a part-time job while I was at uni, and it was the perfect sort of after uni hours job. I absolutely loved it. I think for me, it's the progression. The options are be a swimming teacher or own your own swim school. And I feel like even if I owned my own swim school, I wouldn't get the enjoyment that I got from teaching swimming. And I did really enjoy teaching it. I just couldn't really see myself doing that long term. Because once you've got swim school, like, what then? I'm a very what then person. Like, when I'm in a certain role, it's always, how do I get to the next role? How do I do the next thing? How do I accomplish the next thing? But I feel like it's quite like a saturated market of swim schools everywhere already. There's not a huge gap for something new that can progress really quickly. But yeah, I do miss it a lot. I loved teaching swimming. I do miss being involved, but I just don't think it was the right thing for me then or now.
Yeah. So then we fast forward again to basically where you are now, and you've made that decision to step away from medicine and move into sales. What was that kind of interim period where you've stepped out of medicine? You've done a bit of CrossFit. You've done a couple of half marathons. It's not quite filled the void of what you're experiencing while swimming. What then leads you to think about sales as a career? I mean, was that just a stopgap to experiment because it was low risk? You could love it, you could hate it, but in the grand scheme of things, it'll probably take you 6 months to work it out, and then you can always try something else. Or was it much more considered than that, and you really felt like, actually, sales makes a lot of sense for a variety of reasons? And yeah, maybe Tom leads into that a little bit as well with his experience in the household. Maybe that also paints a picture of why it might be really suitable. Just curious to know how that thought process grows from deciding no longer medicine, and now we're going to give sales a shot.
Yeah, massively the latter. I am not a big risk taker at all. I'm like, it just didn't sort of, I had an offer for my first SDR job before I pulled out of medicine. So I was still going to placement while I was interviewing. Like I didn't leave before I had something concrete signed. But yeah, like Tom's experience of transition, obviously he did law, similar sort of situation, I think, where it kind of wasn't ever really his passion to do that. It was just always something that he ended up doing. And then he went into sales, and just seeing like the lifestyle that it gave him, but also that, like, I guess, yeah, fulfillment back of being able to work really hard at being really good at something and seeing the results almost like directly. Obviously, it doesn't always go to plan, and neither does sports. However, as I guess, a very far back picture, you get out what you put in overall. And seeing how, I think he'd been in sales for probably 2 years at this point, and just seeing how the sort of lifestyle that he had and how he felt about it was definitely pointed me in the right direction. But there was a lot of research done on my part, maybe too much. I am a bit of an overanalyzer, to make sure that it was the right decision. There was obviously always a small risk that it wasn't going to be the right choice. But I wanted to be really, really certain before I left that this was going to be something for the long term, before making that jump.
Did you, you're kind of moving into management, and when you start managing people, you usually have almost different attributes. When speaking to some athletes, they really are kind of sole contributors. They just love their target. They love the fact that whatever they applied in the swimming pool or in rowing or whatever other individual sport, they can just plow all of that focus and energy into absolutely crushing their targets, and it works wonderfully well. But then you decide actually management is something you're keen to explore. So on the basis that generally people who are involved in things like rowing or swimming, there's definitely a strong kind of individual component to it. How are you finding that transition into starting to manage people? And do you feel like you're having to draw on different qualities than you perhaps are used to in that very kind of single-mindedness in pursuit of results? Are you able to draw on experiences in swimming where actually the collective was really important? And how do you kind of bring that out into your team and use that to get the best out of them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's quite a unique point of view to want to go into something because you lack fulfillment in a space of achieving targets, working to tight targets, always sort of being measured on things, and then deciding that actually you would want to go into leadership. I think for me, I've always been very aware of the opportunities I was given, and without those opportunities that I wouldn't have been able to be in the position I was, where I was putting in the hours and doing the work to get the results. Like, it's probably 3 standout opportunities that like completely changed my swimming career, and therefore probably, not to be dramatic, but my whole life in terms of like how everything's panned out. But when I was 11, the coach that said, "There's not any more I can do for you. You probably need to be in this bigger city club with more opportunities," and all that sort of stuff. I think secondly, there was a Swim Wales, the head of Swim Wales at the time, his name was Martin, volunteered me for the open water swimming camp with British Swimming. I'd never swam open water swimming before. I'd never even as much been in a lake with a pair of goggles on, but he like saw potential in me and volunteered me for that camp. And without that, this whole story would have probably been very different. And then obviously the coach I had along the way, who always like saw the potential when I maybe didn't see it myself. So I think I've always been very aware that without those people, the individual success would never have been possible. And so being able to like pass that on in a completely different context. A lot of people come into SDR in maybe a little bit lost in truth. Like they finish uni, they've maybe done a business degree or a maths degree or economics or something where it doesn't really slot directly into like a vocation. They like fall into being an SDR, and then they need someone to firstly like give them a shot, see potential, and then like guide them in the right direction. And so like having the opportunity to give that back to people in like a completely different context is like really fulfilling.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It makes tons of sense. And are you finding the skill of management? I mean, how are you finding it? Because obviously, it is a different thing to go from being an individual contributor to being a manager. And yeah, so how are you finding that process? And are you able to look at some of the qualities that you've just mentioned in some of the coaches who gave you a shot at either the open water swimming camp? Can you cast your brain back to some of those examples or instances, and do you draw from those in the way that you manage your team today, or are you having to almost learn this from scratch from scratch basically, because it is completely new to you?
Yeah, I think in terms of like traits and approaches to things, there's definitely things that can be drawn. Transparency for starters. If you can't be transparent with somebody, you're like doing them a disservice. And if people hadn't been transparent with me throughout my career at certain points as an athlete, I wouldn't have been aware of things that could have been rectified by me at the time. But yeah, in terms of all the other things, it's very much a work in progress. Trying to learn from as many people as I can with like different experiences. Obviously, managing people in a business setting is completely different to managing an athlete or like coaching an athlete. So yeah, there's lots to learn, but I think the core things can always be drawn from the people that I've sort of crossed paths with through sport.
Yeah. The last question is more based around your relationship with sport at the moment. So, Tom hasn't been in the swimming pool or open water since he left swimming, which I always find surprising. But I'm actually hearing this quite a lot from swimmers, actually, that when they leave, they kind of leave. So just curious to know how your relationship is with swimming. Do you still take part, or have you found a substitute sport to kind of make up for that craving?
I'm still trying to find a substitute sport. I haven't swam at all since I stopped swimming. I tried a few times when I first stopped, so when I was still teaching swimming. So within the sort of year or two after I'd stopped, I did try, but I think I will always compare myself to what I used to be able to do. And I think too much of the enjoyment ended up coming from achieving goals rather than the actual act of going swimming. So I really struggled to find any enjoyment in it since I stopped, which is a shame. And one day, fingers crossed, maybe I'll be able to get in and enjoy it. But it's been 7 years, and yeah, not one time I've got in the pool and I thought this is really fun. I've just sort of thought, wow, I'm really slow. I'm still trying to find a sport that I can enjoy without being really good at, but I think it's almost tarnished like every other sport because I did a bit of cycling in the lockdowns and I would be passed by somebody who was clearly a cyclist and it would just make me angry and not want to do it anymore. So it has definitely tarnished any other individual sport, but fingers crossed one day I'll be able to enjoy it again.
That's so funny. I was going to ask if you mentioned about the act of winning is actually, it sounds like winning was basically what was driving you to be a competitive swimmer and an elite swimmer. I've probably not spoken to enough people, but I feel like I hear that a lot rather than people who outright love the sport, or you hear kind of they were a fish when they were a kid. Well, to be fair, not dissimilar to what you described earlier. You swam a mile at 5 or whatever it was. You'd kind of think that there's like an innate love for water because you've just grown up in it so much, and there's obviously something biological as well about being in water. So yeah, it's interesting that actually it's really the competition that kept you going rather than I love swimming and it just so happens I'm also winning. It's almost like the reverse. So I'm enjoying the swimming because I'm winning. When you say the winning out, swimming is nothing to me, which is quite interesting because people define themselves as, oh, I'm a swimmer, But actually what you're probably defining yourself as is I'm a competitor. That's what I do. I love winning. Doesn't matter what sport you throw me in, I will love it because I will win, try and win, rather than I love swimming, which is quite interesting because I like swimming. I just love being in water. And then I also like competing, but one kind of supersedes the other, which I'm really grateful for because it means I don't really get bored of swimming. Even when somebody overtakes me, it's kind of up to them. Doesn't matter, right? I've got 2 wonderful kids at home, so I'm really happy to go back to them, and I'm not letting it define me. But so yeah, interesting kind of what you're describing.
It is interesting. I think that whole issue, I don't want to call it an issue, maybe it's not an issue, but that whole thought process of only enjoying the water when you're sort of competing is something that I think has been recognised by like governing bodies of swimming in the UK, which is really interesting. Obviously, I mentioned at the start of our chat, like when I was younger, you could compete as young as 6 or 7, and they've significantly upped that age for that reason, to try and encourage children to enjoy swimming without any pressure, as opposed to, I got into swim 400 meters when I was 5 and my swimming teacher didn't tell me to stop until I'd swam a mile. That probably was the start of me enjoying achieving things in swimming rather than enjoying the swimming itself. And something that I think, like, obviously Swim Wales, British Swimming, Swim England, whoever else have acknowledged and started to make changes to make sure that there are more people who enjoy swimming as a lifelong activity rather than it be driven by only being happy with it when you're achieving things.
Which is super interesting because when you think about the kind of Brownlee legacy in triathlon, the kind of brand image, I guess, from Alistair now is really about getting people active and enjoying swimming, enjoying running, enjoying cycling. But that's kind of the angle that his legacy is pinned to through what he's achieved at the Olympics. And hence I've always enjoyed triathlon, the outdoors, etc. It almost feels like swimming. I'm just not really, sensing it. I've spoken to quite a few swimmers now, and virtually none of them have kind of stepped back in the swimming pool. And it kind of feels, really paradoxical in some ways, because on the one hand, you're inspiring a whole generation of people at the Olympics by saying, oh, look, these are swimmers, it's what they do, and go and enjoy swimming. But actually the truth is most of those Olympians then decide not to get back in the pool because it's kind of no longer the enjoyment that you'd hope it should be to lead to a healthy life of swimming for the next 20-30 years, basically, knowing how good swimming is even when you're old, right? So of all the sports in the world, you'd say swimming is probably the one that you'd want somebody to still be doing when they're 110. So
I'd be interested to hear, like, from other individual sports, because I'm curious if it's like a swimming thing or whether it comes from sort of individual sports. You can never, so obviously when you're younger, if you play football, it's always a social thing. There's not too much pressure on winning or losing because you win or lose with your team. Whereas in swimming, there's, and maybe other individual sports, there's so much more weighting on being successful just because you're sort of lined up against 8 other people and only one person can win. Whereas in team sports, there's always that element of enjoyment regardless. Maybe the social aspect after a game of football, even from my little brother played football, they would like go to the clubhouse and have sausage and chips, and it was all very relaxed. But individual sports across the board seem to be a lot more strict, maybe is not the word, but intense, potentially.
Maybe more cutthroat as well. It's kind of you win or you don't. It can be quite, and it's quite alone as you described. I don't know. It's a really interesting one. Rowing, for example, there's obviously a component there, but in a weird way, it just feels like swimming is something that we grow up with as kids, that you're told you kind of should do. You're taught to swim at an incredibly young age. So already from day one, you're kind of built in to believe that swimming's a great thing to do, and it feels like it should remain like that for the rest of your life. Whereas with rowing, I don't know what that relationship is like, whether people stop rowing after they've retired. But in some ways, you might argue, well, it's kind of rowing. How many rowing lakes are there in the
Yeah.
world versus how many local swimming pools that you'd expect to see kids at, basically, 7 days a week. But yeah, it's a super interesting question, and I'll definitely keep exploring it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's interesting.
Cool. Well, good stuff. Thanks so much, Sophie, for joining us today. Really enjoyed the session, and yeah, really tons of interesting kind of nuggets about your past and how it's landed you where you are now in sales, and hopefully it's only just a start for you in your sales career. And next time we catch up in 2 years, hopefully there's a whole new chapter to it as well. So yeah, really appreciate your time, and I think our viewers will really enjoy hearing the session as well. So thanks for your time, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to listening to everyone else's episodes as well. It's insightful.